Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, The Invisible Drain on Your Company's Culture, brought to you by Everything Disc, which is a Wiley brand. I'm Katie Furman, and today I'm talking with PhD psychologist Dr. Mark Scullard, who serves as the Senior Director of Product Innovation for Wiley's Professional Learning Division. Mark, thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, thanks. This is really fun stuff to talk about.
So throughout your career as an organizational psychologist, you've focused on a hard truth about business, that no workplace is free from the destructive, culture-draining behaviors that emerge when coworkers don't trust each other. And in your recent ebook, The Invisible Drain on Your Company's Culture, you've illustrated how the source of these destructive behaviors comes from a single root cause, something that all of us struggle with, and that is human insecurity. Could you talk to us about these behaviors and why they can have such a draining effect on company culture?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so I thought what I'd do is kind of start with these two very simple lists. And so one of them here is a list of things you kind of want done less in your organization. And then the second one here is a list of things you want done more often, right? And, if you think about a culture, I'll throw it especially you kind of to start. If you think about a culture you've been at, and not necessarily at Wiley, let's say not at Wiley, right? And maybe maybe a culture that was less than stellar, and not necessarily toxic, right? Just but average, just a normal corporate culture. You look through this first list, and which of those do you think you are most likely to see on kind of a daily basis? And if you're listening, you can kind of play this game at home too.
Absolutely. So when I look at this list, I'm reminded of a time where I went through an organizational restructuring. And a lot of the problematic behaviors you have outlined here were present and even prevalent during that time. Things like gossip were commonplace, with employees trying to work out, who would be kept on or laid off or reassigned. And I also saw things like hiding of mistakes, or rather this disproportionate amount of energy explaining away mistakes or offloading that blame onto another individual or team.
Yeah, and I mean, I think I know. We won't mention names, but like this is a company everyone's heard of, right? And so it to the point is like that's not abnormal. And I think the thing is a little bit of any of these, right? On this first list, right? It's not a showstopper. It's really, I think it's kind of like equivalent to eating a cupcake, right? It's not going to give you a heart attack. At least I hope so, right? Even if you have one cupcake a day, your body's going to be able to absorb it and recover. But each one you have is probably a little bit of a drain on your health. Each one adds up, so that if you're having 5 of these things a day, you're going to be sluggish, right? Your cholesterol is going to go up. You're going to have less room for healthy stuff. And it's kind of the same deal with culture. These things add up one at a time. And so if you look back at kind of the behaviors on this list, they are far more subtle. And a lot of them, right, it's even a judgment call of whether or not someone is in fact being territorial, or withholding information, or excluding someone that they have a grudge against. And so compared to that cupcake, it's just so much easier for these to slip by unnoticed, and really to just get done multiple times a day without anyone noticing. And I would say most of our corporate cultures generously have probably the equivalent of like a 3 cupcake a day diet, which is to say, like enough to really have a meaningful impact on the organizational's health. And if you extrapolate that out, really ultimately to kind of have a meaningful impact on the organization's output and the results that it's able to deliver.
Makes a ton of sense, Mark. And even in my experience, I've seen the amount of time and energy these problematic behaviors have demand from each person day in and day out. And over time, with enough people, you can really start to see how these behaviors can have a huge impact on an organization's ability to perform.
Yeah, and then if you look at this second list, right, this is just kind of like a small sample of behaviors that all really, they're really healthy for organizations to have. And if you look through this list, right, these are things that you want your workers to be doing on a weekly, if not daily basis. There's kind of organizational psychologists call these organizational citizenship behaviors. And, the thing is, like, they're not formal requirements of most jobs. For most of us, they're not on the end of our year evaluation forms. But at the same time, they're absolutely critical for a thriving organization. And and to be clear, like, again, like, missing some of these opportunities, it's far from the end of the world when it comes to your physical health. By analogy, if you go a week without exercising, or a week without taking the time to decompress some of your stress, or to find some alone time, or to have a good social connection, all those things like doctors are constantly telling you to do. Even if you go a week, your body's going to be okay. It's going to be able to absorb that and to keep functioning. But it's these things chronically not happening is when the body really starts to suffer.
And Mark, you're saying that people and organizations, for that matter, they don't even notice that this is happening.
Yeah, it's so subtle and it's so slow. And every opportunity you miss, like, there's a reason for it, right? There's a great excuse, but it's just like it adds up bit by bit by bit. And it's the same thing when you talk about an organization, right? If you don't have people doing these things, you very slowly, imperceptibly add up to kind of a stagnant culture, which means you've got a stagnant organization, which means someone else is ultimately going to out hustle you, out innovate you. They're going to be kind of the first to kind of meet your customers' needs in a more exciting or dynamic or convenient way. It's just that the deterioration is so slow that it doesn't get noticed as a root cause. And again, one of the core problems, one of the core reasons is that, how amorphous these guys are. Pretty much none of these things that you're looking at this list, they are taught in school. They probably most easily fall under the heading of what you call like emotional intelligence. Stuff really no one ever sits you down and explains to you. You're just supposed to kind of absorb this throughout life, kind of unconsciously take this in through some sort of osmosis and then assimilate it into your behavior and personality. And this is like a really like super haphazard expectation that we have for human beings to kind of work environments that we are kind of in no way, shape, or form naturally evolved to function in. Our caveman ancestors did not have these requirements put on them. And then, like we mentioned before, it's like none of these are on the list of kind of formal requirements for the job. And so, at the same time, right, you step back and you look over this list and you say, well, yeah, I'm enlightened, right? Obviously, I want these things in my workforce. In fact, I really want them. But the trick is how do you actually shape a culture in that direction? Or the opposite is, how do you shape a culture away from those kind of toxic cycles? These things, they're so shapeless, so subtle and ambiguous, and you can't create enough rules in your organization or policies or regulations that will get people doing this stuff. You can't legislate them. You could put some of them on the end of your review to encourage them, but the list is just too long. It has to be organic. It has to come from a deeper place.
So, Mark, it seems to be a common practice in our working environments to try to fix these ambiguous problems with a mechanical, one-size-fits-all process of rules and regulations. So how do organizations start to shape culture through an organic approach?
Yeah, and so that's kind of the main thing I want to talk about today is, and really kind of two things, is really like, what is that deeper place that we need these things to come from? And then two, much more practically, is how do you begin to meaningfully shape these things? Right? And so when it comes to that deeper place, you can talk about this from like a very individual perspective, but then of course you can talk about it from a systems perspective. So we're going to start with the individual and kind of work our way up to the system. So if you talk about a single person, right, a single individual, there are obviously a lot of frameworks you can use to understand what's going on in that person's head. But because you've got me here, and because I've been kind of living and breathing this DISC model for the last 15 years, that's the framework we're going to use. And so, it's absolutely only one that you could use, but I think it's a really kind of handy one. And really what I'm going to be focusing on here is kind of the essence of the whole thing, are the subtle ways that insecurities keep us from doing these things that we should be doing, and really leave us clinging to those things that we shouldn't be doing. Right. And so those of you who aren't familiar with the DISC model, just a real quick primer here, right? You've got 4 styles here. D stands for dominance, right? Those are the people who tend to be direct, forceful, and tough-minded. I is for influence, people who tend to be lively, outgoing, optimistic. Steadiness is S, people who tend to be really patient, accommodating, and gentle. And then C is conscientiousness, people who tend to be more analytical and reserved and methodical. So let me start by imagining kind of an employee over here in the S region. And like I said, he's a really patient, even-tempered, accommodating. And on the surface level, this is what we're going to see out of him, right? Like just a great listener, bending over backwards for people, making sacrifices. And so the question is beneath that, what is going on? We're talking about this deeper level. Is if he acts this way on a consistent basis, what drives that? And I think you could approach that question in a lot of different ways, but one very telling way is to look at kind of the psychological needs that drive not only really his behaviors, but his worldview, his assumptions about what's important, about what's appropriate, about what's even possible. And so, what needs would you imagine someone with this style might have, with these behaviors might have beneath those?
Okay, so this is my style. I'm an S style, and I should be an expert, right, Mark? I think there's probably a need for everyone around me to be happy, for there not to be chaos, for things to go just right, for no one to be mad at me, possibly.
There is, well, to my knowledge, there's no one that I know of that's mad at you. I can't speak to your family. But yeah, right. And so as a fellow S style, you can argue with the exact words here, but I think people who fall in this region of the map, right, these kind of really capture some of those needs that are going, these unspoken needs that go on beneath the surface, right? There's this particularly strong need for harmony in their lives. And, like you said, is like everything is going just right, is everyone's happy. It's this kind of fundamental assumption of how things should be, about what's important. And crucially, it's unspoken, right? Even the person themselves, they could probably tell you things like, I like things to be simpatico, but most of the time, kind of the magnitude of this need is really beyond their awareness, right? Not completely, but largely unaware of just how much of their behavior is being driven by this need to have, for instance, harmony in their lives. Okay, and so, what does this look like? What does it have to do with these insecurities that I mentioned earlier? All right, so let me put up a behavior here that is crucial for any well-functioning team. Feedback, right? Candid conversations. It's the ability to kind of talk openly about what's not working. And we've all been in situations where people weren't talking about real issues, and it's paralyzing for a team. You need people in your workplace who are able to do this, plain and simple. Okay, and so you've got someone who's kind of got this very pronounced need for harmony over here, right? And so they're like saying, wait, what? You want me to kind of move over there, and you want me to deliberately invite this pronounced lack of harmony into my life, right? The thing that I just told you that is my most coveted possession, right? And this is all going on beneath the surface, right? The surface level insecurity is kind of look something like this. That's what's going through their head. And that's why instead of stretching all the way over here to the edge of the circle, really they stay firmly in their comfort zone. Instead of doing the confrontation, they maybe kind of offer a small hint, right? But when, of course, that doesn't work, they go back to their cube and kind of redo some of the work themselves, right? And, they're maybe a little bit resentful, they're overworked, but just as important, right? The problem isn't fixed for the next time. So let me give you kind of another couple real quick examples for the same person, but I want to be kind of quick about this because I want to move on to a second person. But here's another thing you want your workforce, people in your workforce, to be doing, right? Really not want, but need, because if they're not doing this, right, you're losing dozens of really good ideas a week. And, some other company's products or processes or service are actually going to kind of gradually make yours obsolete. And, in a high functioning workforce, this is the kind of stretch that we need this, our S guy to be doing here. But again, it's that need for harmony, not to rock the boat. And so, we get a stretch instead that kind of, if we have an insecurity like that, right, that looks like this. So instead of kind of pushing to where we need him to be, what he does is he kind of makes tentative suggestions. And kind of a corset note goes nowhere. Again, it's not the end of the world that this particular thing didn't happen. It's just the cumulative effect of this happening over and over again in your workplace over the course of a year or 2 years or 3 years. All of those opportunities and efficiencies that you're missing out on, right? And then just for the S person right here, for the S style, kind of just one final task, right? And I'll put it up there. And this one I put up there, kind of rallying people behind a vision, because in our 360 surveys, this is consistently the one that leaders get rated the lowest on, particularly managers, is you have people telling them, we really need you to do more of this. You can also look at not just our data, right? The 360 data from Coos and Posner, same deal, right? Consistently their lowest ranked practice. This is one of the much needed skills that leaders at all levels of the organization have a really difficult time doing. And the question is, like, why? Well, the problem is that it depends on the person. For the S-style person here, his need for harmony and acceptance might translate into an insecurity that looks like this, is not wanting to look too self-aggrandizing, right? Not wanting to look like he thinks too highly of himself or his grand plans. And, maybe assuming that, well, if this is a good idea, right, people are going to hear it and they're going to run with it. And so what does he do, right? Well, he kind of stays in his comfort zone where he knows his needs, where, well, we met, and kind of makes this casual mention of it. And unfortunately, but not unexpectedly, right, nothing really comes from it. It fizzles out. All right, so at the risk of kind of belaboring this conceptualization, this way of kind of talking about insecurities, I do want to spend a few minutes here to play out these needs and insecurities in a different person. Because one of the things that makes this kind of so squishy and confusing to address these insecurities is because we're all struggling with different ones. If they were all the same, right, we would have nailed this down by now. But really, it's the difference and the diversity of these insecurities that makes them so messy and confusing for us to deal with, and really kind of make us feel like we're so alone in our insecurities, and kind of keep us from having candid conversations about them. And so I chose this style over here. You see the dot there. It's probably my favorite style. I know I'm not supposed to have favorites, but I find this region so fascinating. So fascinating, in fact, I married someone with this style to study her up close. But if you're not familiar with the DISC model, this is someone kind of between those C and D quadrants. And so here, let me put up some of the typical characteristics that you see here, right? Maybe you can think of someone in your life that fits here. And so you kind of ask, these are some pretty typical behaviors that you might see. All right, and so, what kind of needs might be driving someone to act in this way on a consistent basis?
So I always think of this style as needing to have some sort of mastery over what they're working on, and also really needing to be independent. And I think probably those two things are connected.
Yeah. And so here are kind of some of those needs, really. I think one of the strongest themes is for this style is there's a really pronounced need for competence. Really, first and foremost is really to be competent themselves, right? Is to be perceived as competent, but also kind of to not have to rely on someone who is not competent, right? Who doesn't meet their standards, and the dignity thing there. Obviously we all care about our dignity, but I think there's this particular tendency with this style to really guard that, to not put myself out there in a way that might threaten that. Okay, and so let's kind of pull back again to the organization, right? And this is one of the tasks in an organization. Your hope that people are able to engage in a fairly regular basis, right? This is pretty basic stuff. It's really crucial to solid decision making. And that arrow, right? That's kind of a stretch that we're asking this person to make, this person with this CD style. And just kind of look at those needs. Boy, really, that is kind of stepping on some sacred ground there. Right? You're really undermining that need to show competence, that need to kind of maintain standards. All right, and so you've got an insecurity maybe that looks like this kind of popping into their heads. And so the stretch, really doesn't go outside of their comfort zone, right? Maybe it looks something like that. All right, and maybe I'll kind of skim kind of this next example here, right? This next behavior, all right? But you want your workforce, you want a workforce where compassion and emotional support is a thing, right? And a lot of us have been in places where it wasn't really a thing. For this particular person, though, an insecurity where this particular action is being required and they sense that, right? You might have an insecurity like this being triggered. Right. And so what you get maybe instead of what you would want is this kind of milquetoast response, right? Maybe a quarter of what would actually help in the situation. All right, but let me kind of quickly move on to this last one here, right? A behavior like that. And we saw this one before. And the point I want to make here is that the reason why this particular person doesn't stretch up here to rally people is actually quite a bit different from the reason that our first guy didn't do it, right? She's not doing it because she wants to protect her credibility, her dignity. For him, it was really about maintaining or not looking haughty. All right, let me see if I can put him up there, right? And the messiness, right, of this is kind of one of the big reasons that we don't get our head around these issues, that we fail to see these patterns, why kind of we all think we're so alone in this. And now again, I want to be clear, is like these things not happening, right? And let me put kind of this, just a handful of those behaviors. These things not happening on one or two occasions, it's no big deal, but it's them habitually not happening is where we start to see the drain on our culture. And it's invisible, right? It's subtle, but that's exactly what makes it so pernicious is the cost is they add up day after day after day after day across an entire workforce.
So Mark, this is why your suggestion to take an organic approach to addressing insecurity is so important, right?
Yeah. So, and most of all, kind of this is up to now, like this has all been very descriptive, right? There's nothing in here about like how you actually change it, or even before that is like, all right, well, what are the variables that actually influence these dynamics, these insecurities? Is like, well, can you actually influence something that is drawing from really like this super deep part of us, right? And I want to focus on that thought cloud kind of there for a minute, right? Kind of coming from our CD person, because I think, well, first of all, those insecurities like that, right? They're never going to completely disappear, right? Even if you get like 100 years on this earth and you watch Dr. Phil like every single one of those days, right?
Right.
I mean, if you're lucky, right? And,
of course,
yeah.
Yes.
Maybe that's what the afterlife is going to be like. We can hope, right? You're probably not going to rid yourself of these insecurities completely. But I do think there are some really important variables that influence the size of those insecurities, and then consequently how much they actually restrict our ability to make healthy choices in any given situation, right? And so, it's a question of like, does the insecurity look like that, or does it look something like that? Can I make it shrink? Letting us feel that it's okay, not just stretching like this, right, but to stretch like this, or potentially even like this on a regular basis, right? To the point where that insecurity, it's still there in the background, right? It's not in the driver's seat. And so what influences the power that insecurity has us?
Probably practice, maybe experience.
Yeah, and so like I'll propose kind of two variables, right? And the first, right, is this question is like, what influences that? The first is maturity, right? It's like personal development. It's, that self-actualization, and, not even really like grand enlightenment, but really the kind of that just slow movement forward, right? And the difference between kind of a low level of maturation where insecurities feel really like this, like really pronounced, or a more profound level of maturation where they maybe look like that. And in the DISC model, one of the ways to conceptualize maturity can be shown by looking at comfort zone. So our ability to stretch, right, you can see the comfort zone, and kind of to stretch and to mature, to move beyond kind of that narrow range of responses, to do the thing that the situation actually calls for, rather than the thing that just kind of simply feels comfortable for us. And for a lot of us, that sort of maturation, that just happens naturally as we age. Not everyone, right? You can probably think of someone who is kind of magically able to age without maturing. But often it's this kind of lifetime of experiences that will kind of slowly grind into this unconscious, this message, like, for me, and for you, kind of with this S style, right? It's this strong need for harmony, but kind of slowly grinding in is like, hey, we've had plenty of times without harmony, and you know what? Like, it was uncomfortable, but it wasn't the end of the world. Like, maybe we can let go of that a little bit. But at the same time, I think hopefully is like the research has also shown that there are ways to accelerate that development. And it's not just therapy either, right? Therapy helps. I spent 8 years doing therapy, right? And advocate for it. But you can actually advance it in other ways, and we're not going to go into those due to time constraints. But we worked on some projects here at Wiley, the Everything Disc Productive Conflict. That project is really about kind of helping people monitor and alter the kind of thought patterns that we were talking about earlier, or an emotional intelligence project that really helps people get better at stretching. But what I want to focus on here in the webinar is really the second variable, is beyond maturation, that's really going to kind of influence the size of that insecurity there, right? And that is the environment or the situation that you find yourself in. And I think for most of us, there's an element of common sense here, right? So, you can think of a time where you had some insecurity, and you thought you had mastered this thing, and you really, you felt like, oh, I haven't struggled with this in a while. You're kind of proud of yourself, and then suddenly you find it flaring up in this particular situation, and you're like, crap. It's like, right, like I thought I moved beyond that, right? And so we kind of have this like small range in those situations. It's like we hug tight to these really instinctive responses, this very narrow range, because when you're in stress mode, right, your brain guides you towards what you know really well, what's safe and familiar. And so for this person, right, it's going to be looking like responses like this. And it's not that these are unproductive responses. These are productive a lot of the time, but right now, that's not why these responses are being used. They're being used because she's in threat mode, and these are what feel safe and familiar. And so this insecurity is at peak potency with all, that's a pull. It's like this black hole, right? Is so powerful that it would almost take some sort of superhuman force to kind of defy it.
Sure. And that makes sense, Mark. And with our rapidly changing work environments most of us find ourselves in today, I think it is reasonable to expect that a lot of people are operating in stress mode on a fairly regular basis.
Yeah, and I think the good news, right, is that like the opposite can also happen, right? You've probably experienced this too, is like you have some insecurity that you normally struggle with, but you find yourself in either a supportive situation or with a supportive group of people that you really know well, and it's not nearly as potent. All right, and this, I think, is really one of the opportunities that we have as organizations, is to create an environment where people can let down their guard, to feel like it's okay if they screw up, where they trust one another to kind of give them the benefit of the doubt, or they trust that other people are looking out for their best interests. And so we're able to kind of do this. Right.
Wow.
And so, that insecurity, right, it's still there, right, but it's kind of lost that consuming power over us, right? we're actually able to be our best self, right? To make choices based on what the situation actually calls for, rather than on what those underlying needs dictate. And if we establish this, we get kind of all sorts of those kind of micro healthy behaviors that may have gone unactualized, right? That second list from the beginning. And at the same time, all those kind of sort of like micro unhealthy behaviors, right? Those kind of things from that first list, right? They never actually materialize in the first place. And so, when it comes to that environment, what is it that allows people to make these historic stretches, right? And I think there are some good candidates out there, but I think you'd be kind of hard pressed to come up with, a better answer than trust, right? Trust is kind of really a great answer to this unjustified insecurity.
And Mark, you outlined this idea of cultivating cultures of trust as a counter agent to insecurity. So tell us, what are the benefits trust can have on organizational culture?
Yeah, so you've got, I'll put up here is this next slide here, and this is from an HBR article from a guy named Paul Zak, who spent a couple of decades studying the effect of trust in organizations, and you can see the impact on different aspects of ROI. On the other hand, these very kind of tangible benefits, but on the other hand, right, trust feels like this really amorphous, intangible thing, right? It kind of feels, right, you could debate whether or not it is an emotion, right? But it feels kind of squishy, right? But instead you kind of focus, well, let's focus on fixing our processes, or let's focus on our strategy, right? But this thing, trust, right? It has these very tangible impacts, right? These very real and important outcomes. So, but the question is, like, how do you improve something that is as intangible as trust? Is there anything you can actually do about it, right? And it is certainly not easy, but thankfully, like, you can, right? There are some established ways of doing this, right? And this year I kind of put up like a wholly inadequate list here, right? Just to illustrate the point that there is something that an organization, it's something an organization does have control over, right? Even if it feels like in the moment you're trying to control the currents of the ocean, right? And none of these things, like, none of them are panaceas, right? It's still a very difficult undertaking. But from the last slide, it's absolutely worth it. And in the little time I left, though, is what I want to focus on kind of is one of the interventions that I have particular expertise in, which is the DISC workshop. And I'm going to kind of start with this very basic question, which is which is a natural question, is like, well, what does learning about like a personality model like this have anything to do with building a culture of trust? And so, it's this question of like, you have a group of people that are spending 6 hours, 4 hours, maybe even just 2 hours going through one of these personality-based workshops. Is, how do they actually come out on the other end with trust? It's like if you're taking some sort of medication or a pill, you take it, 2 a day, every day for 2 weeks, and you start to feel better. But presumably, even you as a patient, right, you don't even need to know why it's working, right? You might be curious, but that's not going to impact the effectiveness. But you would hope, right, that the pharmaceutical company actually has a decent idea why it's being effective, right? And they don't always. But knowing the answer to that question is really going to be pretty important if you want to improve the drug later on down the line. And you'd also like to think that the doctor, right, the facilitator in this analogy, right, has an understanding of how the drug works. And so, that's really going to help her problem solve around, let's say, adjusting the medication.
Okay, so what are the activities?
Yeah, so what's going on there? And so as a product development guy, right, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this question. And here's kind of like the simplest way I think I can put it, is what is that active ingredient? Why does investing and putting people through a collective experience like this lead to greater trust? And I'm not going to say this is a definitive list, right? I kind of put up 3 primary ingredients here, 3 reasons why. And they start with things that actually happen directly in the classroom, and they kind of move on to stuff that's primarily used outside the classroom. And the first is vulnerability. And of course, we work at Wiley, we work a lot with Patrick Lencioni's model, and that kind of very foundational element is vulnerability-based trust, is this idea that for a group of people who work together, there's this ceiling on how effective they're going to be as a team, and which is kind of vulnerability-based trust. That ceiling is directly related to how vulnerable they can be with each other. And we work with a lot of consultants who do these 5 behaviors workshops, and you talk to them over and over again. You hear how absolutely crucial it is to develop this foundation of vulnerability-based trust before you can really help the team, move on to working through their deeper issues, right? If that ability to be vulnerable is not there, then the rest of the steps really, they just end up being platitudes. Like it's just people kind of nodding their heads in the meeting or the workshop, right? And going back to the same old unhealthy behavior. Nothing's going to change if you don't establish that. And so one of the things that happens in kind of these personality-centered workshops is that people are able to kind of just share their struggles and limitations in a way that's non-threatening and non-judgmental atmosphere. And the reason why it's non-threatening is because of this kind of fundamental assumption that the tool has, is that everybody has limitations, right? I mean, they have strengths too, right? But the participants, like, they very quickly pick up, almost immediately, that it's okay to own these limitations, in front of these people, because we're all doing that. Something that, in your day-to-day work, right, you very rarely have the opportunity to have these type of conversations in a non-awkward way, right? You see yourself, I'm talking about my kind of flaws openly. I'm talking about my flaws and quirks and idiosyncrasies, and you know what? I'm not being ridiculed, right? I'm not being, looked down upon or pitied, right? This is like a tremendously powerful experience, and it causes people, usually without even really knowing it, to internalize this message that, it's okay to be imperfect or messy or really just kind of human around these people. It's okay to be vulnerable. And this related to the second active ingredient, and which I'll put up here, is kind of acceptance and appreciation. There's this concept that's referred to as judging to the judging to valuing ladder that's been used in DISC workshops for decades, long before my tenure here. Basically, the idea that there's this instinctual, it's so natural and tempting for us to equate different with bad, but the goal is kind of to move someone from that judging stance to one where they actually want to understand the differences, and then kind of one where they appreciate and respect those differences, to finally one where they actually value the differences that people bring to the table. And so in these workshops, right, you don't need to get preachy, right? I mean, because people turn off when you do that. Or tell people how valuable they are in the workplace. It just kind of naturally falls out of the conversation, right? Again, people internalize the message without even knowing it, that these differences that can sometimes be so confusing, if not frustrating, right? These differences are actually crucial to us succeeding. And then finally, let me put up there kind of that last final ingredient, right? And of course, you can certainly make a case that there are others, but this final one that I'll mention is a common language. And in some respects, this is really codifying those gains that we just talked about in the group, because the emotions and the impressions that you have in these workshops and these experiences, right? They fade. And this language is a new way to talk about differences, a way that kind of calls back to the insights that you had in the classroom once you've been back on the job for a month, or for 6 months, or for a year, right? It enables me to have a conversation about those differences in a way that I never could before, right? Whereas before, right, like I couldn't mention to Aditi that she's direct, because she's like, wait, what do you mean I'm direct, right? What are you getting at? Like, what's the underlying judgment here? And now we have this social contract. We've agreed that, what? It's completely valid way. Being direct is a completely valid way to be in the workplace, right? Particularly this workplace. And so, we can bypass that defensiveness and the tiptoeing and really have this straightforward, honest conversation about real topics, right? That language gives you the trust, which gives you the ability to be real with one another.
I think it's pretty empowering to know that there are some tangible ways for organizations to start cultivating cultures that bring out the best in their workforce.
Yeah, and like I said, right, this is not the only way to do this, and it shouldn't be the only way you're trying to build trust in your organization, but it's a proven method that's been kind of used like tens of thousands of times and kind of refined over decades.
So Mark, the DISC model you just shared with us a few minutes ago, it powers Wiley's 2 personality-based learning experiences, both of which can help apply these active ingredients to an organization. And, the first one I just want to share quickly is Everything DISC, which is a personal development learning experience that measures a person's priorities and tendencies based on the DISC model. And, each application within this portfolio delivers a personalized insights that make behavior change possible. And then from there, the 5 behaviors of a cohesive team, you talked about this a bit. It's a team development learning experience that helps individuals and teams build effective team culture by applying Patrick Lencioni's 5 behaviors model. And that trust module that you see at the foundation within the learning experience, it's powered by DISC, and it really digs in deep to unlock that vulnerability-based trust on a team. And, of course, these experiences, they don't just happen. If you throw a group of people in a room with their personality profiles, I'm sure, we're attempting to connect humans on a more human level, and that requires some nuance and finesse, right?
Yeah, it's like having someone to help guide the discussions, to push people to open up, to recognize when the language of personality is being misused, right? And, people who can help customize the classroom experience to kind of fit the needs of whatever the particular culture is.
Sure. So at Wiley, we've been lucky throughout the decades to partner with thousands of these coaches, consultants, and trainers, not only to hear insights about what works best in the classroom, but also to create events that genuinely transform culture. And in fact, when we survey DISC and 5 behaviors users, this network earns a 94% global satisfaction rating among DISC and 5 behaviors users. So it's a pretty cool partnership that we've built with this network. And Mark, that's all we have for today. Thank you. It's been really interesting and insightful.
Yeah, thanks. I love talking about this stuff. So.
And a big thank you to all of our attendees for spending this time with us today. If you are looking to spark meaningful culture change in your organization, Everything DISC and the 5 behaviors of a cohesive team are great places to get started. You likely have an authorized partner that you work with, so start a conversation and take what you've learned today a bit further into your organization. If you don't have an authorized partner, you can visit everythingdisc.com or the5behaviors.com to find a partner through our online partner locator. Simply click Find a Partner, answer 3 quick questions, and receive a list of partners that you can contact directly. That concludes today's webinar, The Invisible Drain on Your Company's Culture. Thank you again, and have a great rest of your day.